stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Storymaker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, and to connect. But what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, the next step is to develop how you share them. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you and you'll nod your head in understanding. Then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those situations. During this podcast, I'm asking you to listen to consider your own related stories and to consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Today's podcast features Gail and Rebecca from Next Op Search. Your stories don't define you, but how you share them will. I am interviewing Gail and Rebecca today from Next Op Search, and I couldn't be more excited about learning a little bit more about them. Gail and Rebecca at Next Op Search are recruiters, but they have a side to their business that is really something that I find valuable and important, and I can't wait to dig in a little bit more about why you do that aspect of your business. So first, because I met Rebecca first, Jason Ellinger on LinkedIn, I'm going to ask you first, Rebecca, tell me something about yourself that most people wouldn't know.
Sure. So something that you might not know is growing up, and it's really shaped who I am today, I believe. I watched my mom constantly reinvent herself. And I think when I was a child, I didn't think too much of it. You know, she went from being a college teacher in computer science to a project manager in a financial services firm to teaching middle school. Then she taught ESL, and actually now she just started a brand new company and is thriving. So I've always thought of life, I think, in a very nonlinear sense, and our careers and what success is, and just constantly redefining that. And so I think that's something that you wouldn't necessarily see on my LinkedIn bio or come across, and it's really shaped who I am today. And I definitely want to help other people realize that we can reinvent ourselves, and we constantly have to redefine what motivates us and what we're passionate about.
I love that. It brings in so many of my thoughts about my own mother. And it's funny that at the time when we're growing up, it doesn't occur to us unless they share details about it. And I think most parents don't talk to their kids about what they're doing and why they're doing it, what their motivation is behind it.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
I love that you picked that up, and that as an adult, you can look at it and say, oh, that's why I don't think the way a lot of other people think. That's
Definitely.
Cool.
I never saw myself going into a career where you have a traditional path. I always thought I'll just keep asking myself what makes me feel fulfilled and what is success and what am I passionate about. And if I find myself off track, I can always change the track.
I love that.
More
than you could know.
It's not easy. It's definitely not. But I
No.
saw her do it so many times that it's very inspiring to me.
Does she know that?
She does now, but I think it's something I've really come to terms with recently that I've realized. Because like you said, as a child, you just see your parents doing things. You don't necessarily understand the significance of it until we really have that perspective.
Well, at some point, we're just going to have to bring her into the conversation. She sounds a lot like my mother. And so I love that story. That's perfect. Thank you. Gail, what do you have in your head?
So, Rebecca and I, as business partners and friends, connect on so many levels. But one of the things that is very similar in our backgrounds is how influential our mothers have been. This could turn into a Mother's Day special, by the way.
Good. I like that.
My story is also related to my mother. My inspiration personally for wanting to help victims of domestic violence came from my exposure to it as a teenager. My mom had a daycare and preschool, and at a time when there were very limited resources, certainly nothing available on the internet, very limited government resources. My mom participated in an underground railroad of sorts where she was connected with other women who were willing to help women who needed to get out of these situations safely and provide resources for them. So there was a couple of women that my mom got to know, parents in her daycare that needed assistance, and she provided them that first leg.
Wow.
And connected them with the people that could help them. And so as a teenager working for my mom, and of course I had very limited knowledge at the time of what was going on, but certainly was somewhat exposed to it and learned more about it as I got older. It just made such a lasting impression on me, because these were women that I came in contact with and seemed fine to me, you know? And so it just blew me away that they had this, that they were suffering in the way that they were behind closed doors and wearing a mask every day and showing up and bringing their kids to daycare and going to work. And so it just resonated with me and ultimately shaped who I am and influenced my choices in business.
Wow. And you haven't really shared that story much, have you?
No.
Not much.
I
Wow.
shared it with Rebecca, of course. And that was kind of the catalyst behind us developing this program, because it really resonated with Rebecca, and she started to do some research on domestic violence, and from that uncovered how intertwined financial abuse and domestic abuse are, and how there's a vast percentage of women. I think, what is the percentage, Rebecca?
99% of victims are, a part of financial abuse as well, which is when someone else controls your finances in any sense. And 74% of women said they would have left earlier if it wasn't for financial concerns.
So we recognize that we have this skill set to offer to women who are trying to get out of these situations, where we can, provide career coaching to them and help them with their, resumes and, social media profiles if they're able to go that route, and just kind of give them an extra, leg up in getting out in the world and ultimately achieving financial independence. And it was the combination of Rebecca's research and my story that really was the catalyst behind us developing this program.
Wow. Do you remember the first woman that you helped with that?
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about her. I mean, how did she come to you? How did you know?
Are you talking about our Hire One, Help One program we have now?
Yeah. We partner with domestic violence crisis centers. So we are a piece of the puzzle. They have a full service offering for these women that includes legal assistance, credit counseling,
housing,
emotional support groups.
We have a couple of facilities here in Helena that are like that, the YWCA and the Friendship Center. And yes, they
very active.
Right. Yeah. And they combine all of those resources in incredible ways to form teams to help women get out of that situation.
Yeah, it's a full, you need a full circle to solve this problem. It's very complicated and there are a lot of things involved. So we by no means think that if you get a job, it's going to solve it and break the cycle. We work alongside experts who have been helping in all these different areas like legal, counseling, housing, financial help in order to tackle the problem. But we all know that having a job can really be a huge step in gaining financial independence.
Right. And confidence. I mean, just having a job where you are bringing in a decent income that can cover your housing for you and your children. And yeah, I mean, confidence alone is a huge piece of that puzzle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So the women come through those centers and we partner with them in order to make sure that we're, giving assistance in the best way possible. And it's very case by case, depending on where the person kind of is in the situation.
Right.
And we went through training so that we could be certified by the state to interact with these women on a one-on-one basis. And ultimately, our goal is to, as we expand the for-profit center of our company in different cities, to expand the nonprofit part of it. So in each city that we open an office, we will be partnering with the local domestic violence crisis center there in that particular location, and replicating the program ultimately with a goal of having this be a national.
Wow. That's a huge goal. It's an awesome goal. I love it.
It gets
So
us up in the morning.
yeah, I'm sure. I mean, you have to have that, something that's going to be rewarding, even though your jobs in your for-profit can certainly be rewarding because you're helping people get jobs and you're also helping companies fulfill needs.
We're so inspired by these women, and they help us as much as we're helping them because we see what they're overcoming on a daily basis.
Well, I kind of want to come back to that first part of your story about your mom and the fact that these women look like normal, everyday women, that you wouldn't know how much danger they were in, or how much they were suffering. And so did you and your mom talk about what was going on at all?
My mom was very careful about not sharing too much with me because I was a teenager at the time.
Right.
Wanted to obviously maintain the confidence and protect me. But she gave me a little bit of information, enough for me to know in general what was happening, and then certainly elaborated more as I got older.
Mm-hmm. Well, my guess is that not only was she trying to keep you from learning too much and what could be a danger to you,
Sure.
but I guess more of it to me would be, what lessons could you learn to keep you from ending up in that situation? Because it could be any of us. I mean, this isn't something that only happens to a certain population of our communities.
Yeah.
This happens to everyone.
It knows no bounds. No gender, race, ethnicity, income level. I mean, this is something that touches people in all walks of life. I was astonished then, and I'm astonished now.
Mm-hmm.
It's happening to people that you would least expect.
Yeah, I know.
And there's still such a stigmatism attached to it. So, Rebecca and I feel so passionately that this work is important, because the more resources are available, the more that this is talked about, hopefully the more women will feel comfortable coming forward and reaching out for help.
And hopefully sharing their stories so that other women don't end up in that situation.
Absolutely.
Understanding what the cues are. What are the signals that this person is likely to physically and emotionally abuse you? I know as I was growing up, so my dad was bipolar, and he didn't know what he was doing. He had that illness, but he would get mean, and it was never physical, but he would get kind of mean. And I remember telling him one time that wasn't okay.
Wow.
I think I was 15 years old. And
wow.
I said, that's not okay. And I remember my mom not knowing what to do. She was in that generation that you don't argue, you don't fight it, you don't speak about it.
Yeah.
But as a teenager, I observed this and made absolutely sure that when I saw those kind of signals coming from a guy, I would distance myself immediately. But I saw that my sister would fall into this trap because she didn't necessarily observe what was going on in a negative way.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is so incredible, to your point, is the preventative measures are so important with domestic violence. And the crisis center that we work with has an incredible program where they're going into schools and they're speaking with middle schoolers
about boundaries.
Yeah, about boundaries and what's okay and what's not okay.
And dating and friendships and texting. With technology today, boundaries can be blurred.
And I think that's a big part of it is, establishing education and knowledge from a very early age, establishing those boundaries so that kids grow up knowing what's okay and what's not okay, and certainly the signs to look for even in their peer circles.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that sounds like an amazing program. I don't think I see anything like that in Montana, but it's possible there are programs like that I don't know about. I'll have to look into that. Now I have to do some research because those are so important. And I know that there are people making efforts about that now, but I'm not sure we're doing enough.
No.
So Rebecca, I kind of gave you a little hint in the podcast prep document about some of the questions that I would ask you.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I always like to dig into in people is finding out pivot points in their lives, something specific, some event or a conversation that at the time you wouldn't necessarily have known that this was going to change how you view the world and how you view yourself. But do you have one of those, particularly in your young adulthood, that kind of define who you are now?
There's one that I've actually been thinking of lately. I actually had, it was probably just a couple years, or actually I was still in college. There was a period in time where I was finishing up college and I was living with my now husband in Park Slope in New York. And I was waitressing to support us. He was going through a career transition. So he was unemployed at the time and really trying to hold out to make this transition. Transitions are really tough. Anytime someone goes to work for themselves or really wants to make the next leap, it's not always easy. And there can definitely be friction. And we struggled through, I think, and sometimes I post about it, but it was probably about 2 years of time where we really struggled to make ends meet. We ate a lot of SpaghettiOs and a lot of
ramen noodles.
Yeah, that's what everyone says, but it's so true. I mean, it's exactly what happened. And I waitressed, and everyone tells you from the outside, this is just a stage, you're going to get through it. And you hear it, but it sounds like such a cliche. Obviously, being out of it now, and looking back on it, I would say the same thing to someone else just to keep pushing. But it has taught me so much about what to be grateful for. And it's not as if I see that as the bottom and I could be there again any point. I more so look at that time in my life for understanding and for gratitude of what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck, of what it's like to look for a job. I almost wish everyone can kind of go through a period in their life like that. Because
I do wish that.
Yeah. Yeah, because it really does. And it's awful when you're going through it. There's no way around it. I mean, our relationship struggled, our positivity struggled, obviously paying the bills struggled. But now looking back, I the way I behave today and what I'm grateful for, I'm so happy I went through that period.
And I think people go one way or the other in that situation. Either they decide that they could do it, so why can't everybody else? Pulling themselves out of it once they get out. Or they look at those people that are struggling and think, wow, I've been there. I know how hard that is. I'm going to do everything I can to help.
It's taught me a lot about empathy, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's like you can either go the empathetic route or the judgmental route. It's interesting. It's an interesting point.
It is. So there's a specific story in my head from that kind of time in our lives when our boys were really little and my husband was consulting and I wasn't working yet because we had decided that I would stay home. I had started my own business, going to people's homes and offices and training them on their computers. And I was teaching computer classes at the local tech college as adjunct faculty, but it wasn't nearly enough money. Even our mortgage from month to month was going to be late or, certainly not on the first of the month because we didn't know when Bob's paycheck would come in. And what I remember vividly is this one time going into the grocery store and I had the boys with me and I'm looking at the milk and I'm looking at the eggs and I'm thinking, which one should I get today? Because I can't get both.
Yep. Yep.
And
I remember in Park Slope, I wanted fruit.
Right.
Blueberries. And I couldn't have, we can't afford to buy fruit. And I said, one day I'm going to be able to buy, and now my fridge always has strawberries and blueberries. And my husband takes the Tupperware of blueberries, strawberries, and raspberries to work every day. And obviously everyone thinks it's crazy. But it's these little things of like, I bet you go to the grocery store now, and when you buy milk and eggs, you remember it wasn't always like that. And you're very grateful for where you are because of it.
Absolutely. So when you would walk into the store, and do you have any specific memories like that? Like that's such a vivid memory to me. Do you have that kind of?
No, it was literally blueberries and strawberries. I used to buy the frozen bags and try to make smooth. I mean, I tried to be healthy at that point in my life. I still try to be healthy,
right?
But I wanted to eat fruit and I couldn't afford it, so I bought the frozen ones. I mean, you figure out another way, but I always remember it would be a really big deal when I could afford fruit weekly, fresh fruit.
That is definitely a pivot point. And knowing that time in your life was such a big struggle, it really helps you identify with other people, especially the population that you're working with in the nonprofit. So how about you, Gail? What's your pivot point? One of them.
I had a pivotal point in my 20s. I actually had degenerative disc disease that became very acute when I was about 25, which is quite young. Usually that becomes acute later in life. And I ultimately ended up having a spinal fusion and had to lay in traction for about 4 to 5 weeks following the surgery. And, this was something that was just nobody I knew was going through at my age. And I was on a very structured path in life up to that point. I was very certain about what college I wanted to go to and what I was going to major in and what career I chose after I was going into banking, and there was no question about it. And having that surgery and having that alone time with my thoughts as I laid in traction following the surgery really made me evaluate who I was and what my dreams really were and what I was passionate about. And just the value of each day. And I came out of that and ultimately quit my job and moved to California and pursued other things and interests, and just my whole view of life and my perception of things was altered forever by that surgery. And I'm grateful for it because I fear that if I didn't have that, even though it was really, really hard to go through, if I didn't have that happen to me at such a young age, I would have never had allowed myself to have the experiences that I've had, because I would have been so hell-bent on this one path that I had structured for myself. I would have never opened my mind to other things had that experience at such a young age.
I think a lot of us go through that kind of thought process of having an idea of what we want. And unfortunately, so many end up just sticking with it because it's what they think they want, but they don't reassess periodically to make sure.
Yeah.
I've heard people go through medical school and then realize they don't want to be a doctor.
Yes.
Like, wow.
Yeah.
So Gail, do you remember?
Sometimes we cling to things that we're good at, but sometimes what we're good at is not what we love doing. And that's a really hard choice to make.
That's such a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, really important. Yeah, I think that was a topic on a podcast a few weeks ago, was choosing to do something you're good at that you don't necessarily enjoy. And sometimes we have to, but other times.
There are a lot of things we have to do in life that we don't love.
Right.
You got to somehow find time for the things that you love so that you can appreciate life.
Yeah, like laundry.
So
I love laundry.
I don't mind doing laundry if I only have to do it once in a while. But you know what I find is when I have a really good keynote, or I have a gig where I sing and it's like a really great night and great audience and I'm getting all these kudos. And then I get home at 3 a.m. and I get up the next morning and I'm cleaning the bathroom. Like, That's just not right. I'm a rock star. But yes, sometimes we have to do the things we don't like.
It's a rude awakening that we all have. It's like what's the magazine where you see the pictures of the celebrities and they always like to point out when they're just like us and it's like them grocery shopping or folding laundry.
Right, right. And I think it keeps us humble. I know that if I didn't have those things to bring me back down to reality and I'm just me, if I didn't have those things, I don't know that I would be as compassionate.
Yeah.
I don't know. Or grateful for that matter. So Gail, when you came out of that, there had to have been people in your life that either were surprised or just simply supported you. I'm so curious now. So you spent 4 to 5 weeks in traction. I know you spent a ton of time by yourself in your own head, which can be really dangerous sometimes, but clearly that was a good thing for you. Yeah. Who was in your life at that time that made an impact in a conversation after you realized what was going on in your head?
I have to say I'm very fortunate to have an incredibly supportive group of family and friends.
Gail has like 900 cousins. I'll just interject that every time she goes somewhere, she starts a story with my cousin so-and-so, and I have no idea.
I do. I have a lot of cousins. I'm an only child, but I have so many cousins and really amazing relationships with so many of them. But I wasn't alone. I did recuperate in the house I grew up in with my mom and my aunt there. And though I was in my childhood bedroom, which was somewhat surreal with the flowers.
Awkward.
I would wake up like, who am I? Where am I? What's happening?
Did you ever see that movie with Nicolas Cage and Peggy Sue Got Married?
Oh, yes. Oh, my gosh. I haven't seen it in years, but I do remember that movie.
So that's what that reminded me of.
Yeah.
I loved that movie. That was an awesome movie.
Yeah, it really was.
Okay. So you're in your old childhood bedroom.
Yeah. But as I was going through that time and, reevaluating my life and talking about it with my girlfriends and my cousins and my mom, everyone was really supportive. I'm very, very fortunate. No one said, that's too risky. Stay where you are. That's not the safe route. Mm-hmm. Everyone I know was really encouraging and supportive of me going out there and trying something different and choosing a different path. And I wish that for everyone. I know how much I want to have that.
Right. Do you remember any specific conversations? I'm asking that because I had a very specific conversation in my head when you were saying that from when I was a senior in college and I was applying for a paid internship in DC, and a specific conversation I had with my mother. But do you have anything like that?
I have so many conversations with my mother. I don't know if I could pinpoint one. So I don't think I could really draw on a specific conversation, but mm-hmm. certainly there were many. And, the gist was always follow your heart. And if that's what you want to do, I'm behind you 100%.
Do you remember getting ready to leave to go to California and what that was like?
Yeah, it was, I moved out there with all this gumption and drive, and I didn't know a soul. And I think about 3 weeks in of being alone, I'm a very sociable person, and I really didn't have I was just talking to random people, when I was out for a walk or in CVS.
There was no Facebook or LinkedIn,
no Facebook,
right?
Connections online.
So it was a little bit lonely initially, and I remember calling my best friend and saying, I think I overestimated myself. Maybe this wasn't a good idea.
What did she say?
She said, well, you can come home if you want.
Oh, no. Wrong answer.
I know.
Gail does not give up, by the way. Nothing you say to her will make her give up. So she was never about to just go back home.
Yeah, it just drove me more. I was going to prove myself. And ultimately, I made some of the best friends of my life. It just took a little time. I had to be
So how long were you there?
6 years.
6 years? That's a long time.
It was, yeah. I
Wow.
started
So,
my first company there. I started an organic food company while I was living there.
wow.
And it was
So
amazing.
what was, wow, that's so cool. An organic food company. So
Yeah,
producing it or selling it?
producing it. I took
Wow.
recipes that were my grandmother's and made them all organic. We sold them in the frozen food section of independent markets, Whole Foods. It was an amazing experience.
Wow. And then did you sell the company later before you moved back to New York?
I actually moved back to New York with the company and continued it here. And then ultimately we merged it with another company. And then I left
Wow.
the business and came back to recruiting and started
So
this
it
company.
sounds, so you and Rebecca have a lot in common in terms of reinventing yourselves and trying new things. And I did look at your profile briefly, Gail, and I saw some of that trajectory, and I was like, oh, this is a woman just like me. The definitely gets bored and has to switch gears.
Yeah, and it's something that was so amazing to me about what Rebecca spoke about earlier. I actually always felt somewhat disappointed in myself when I would look back at my career path and see that there were so many different directions. I felt like it was a disadvantage when I would tell my story, and I had different careers in different verticals. And when Rebecca shared with me about her mom and how her perception of that was, wow, that's a positive. That's an amazing thing to have experience and exposure in different industries and do different things. It made me look at my life differently. So I was so appreciative of her perspective because I always saw it as, I don't know, maybe a negative and never looked at
Which
it
I
from a
think most people, I think that's probably what most people think. I think most people at this point in life, in society, aspire to have a linear career, one that fits on a resume, one that makes people quickly understand where they came from and what the through line is. I don't think most people grew up with a mom like mine that reinvented themselves, but I think in the future, and I think we're starting to get there, we're not going to have linear careers anymore. I'm a huge believer that we'll have gaps in our resume, whether it's to take care of family that's older than you, younger than you, your own health issues, whatever it may be, a sabbatical, traveling, finding yourself. And I also think people are going to switch industries and careers, and the through lines are going to be harder to explain than what we've thought of in a very traditional sense. Like it's going to be more storytelling, and we're going there. It's a very hard transition, I think, for society to make. But if we can help these women through our Hire One Help One program reinvent themselves and understand that, yes, you're going to have to explain more of why you took time off or why you did, because that's where we are today. It's going to get easier with time.
Yeah. And your best life is the life you're living right now. Yes. And it's definitely becoming more socially acceptable to have gaps on your resume and change jobs. I read an article recently, just a few days ago, and it was titled Burnt Out. It's up on my screen right now. Burnt Out Millennials Quitting Lucrative Jobs to Live Their Best Life. And it was
awesome.
About exactly that, how the millennial generation views things completely differently than past generations. And they're willing to work a couple years, take their savings, and take a year off and travel the world.
Here's the thing I think about a lot. There are two things in my head now that I kind of want to bring up. One is, Gail, the reason so many of us struggle, my friend calls it being a career gypsy. And I love that, Wendy Blackwood.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons you and I might have struggled with that, feeling like that wasn't a good thing necessarily, isn't because it's not a good thing. It's because when somebody wants to hire us, it's really hard for us to apply that, all of those different experiences, not to apply it to what we're going to do, but to apply it in order to explain that to somebody and tell the story.
You feel you're at a disadvantage during the interview and recruiting.
It doesn't fit into a box.
Right, exactly.
Ultimately, it's the fact, what makes me, I think, good at my job today are all of those experiences.
Exactly.
They're part of the fabric of who I am.
Right, but how do we describe that to the hiring manager especially with a resume, if all they're going to see is your resume, and there are some resume writers, Linda Spiegel in New York and Jared Weiss, but Linda Spiegel with Rising Star Resumes, she's kind of a master at taking all of those seemingly disconnected jobs,
yeah,
and making the language clear that you apply everything you learned from those experiences to make yourself successful in whatever you take on next.
exactly.
So I think that's a big key in helping people with those career gypsy experiences see it in such a positive light. But the other thing that you triggered in me, Gail, is I get this visceral reaction to generation speak. And I know that there are aspects of generations that you can absolutely generalize and quantify and qualify because of what we experience. Like, I call myself the microwave generation. I think Gen Xers are the ones that started to really lose patience with things moving slowly. It wasn't accepted. And I call it the microwave generation because it was the microwave that kind of brought us to this point. Because because I would look in the frozen food aisle at 12 or whatever, however old I was when we got our first microwave. And if something took longer than 22 minutes, I'd put it back. I'm like, gosh, but then maybe 5 years later, I'm like, 12 minutes, forget that. I'm going to go get the thing that takes 8. It was so there are aspects of generational generalizations that we can use. When it comes to this career gypsy stuff, though, you and I, all three of us have experienced that. I don't know what generation you are, Rebecca, because you look super young, but and so do you, Gail. But by the way you're speaking, I'm like, okay, she's probably closer to my age. But what I think about
the microwave generation for sure.
Yes. Okay. So what I look at is there are a ton of people like us that qualify as a Gen Xer or even some baby boomers who did that, who behaved that way because that's what they wanted, and because they were brave enough, courageous enough to say, I've never been in that industry, but I'm going to try it anyway because I know myself well enough to know that I can do it. And they happen to, know the right person or get in at the right moment to be able to experiment that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you're right, Rebecca, in that you're saying that more of us have to be accepting of that and encouraging of it in some cases, as long as it's not being detrimental to the community and the people around them.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, we're not all going to have linear paths, and to hold those people back is not good for society, to be honest. We could all be solving problems and be a part of something bigger if we're exploring what we're best at. And to explore what we're best at, we have to try things that we might not be good at.
I love that. I love that you just said that. It's not where I was going, and I just love that. So let's go deeper into that. Gail, what was your experience that you realized that recruiting is your thing? I mean, there had to have been one particular story, like when you placed somebody that you went, oh my gosh, not only am I great at this, I love it. It's meaningful to me.
Yeah. I've actually had a few of those, so I'm going through my head to choose one. I had a candidate who was working as a data programmer, and he couldn't find. He had a stellar resume, all of his certifications, all of his formal education, and quite a long history with a Fortune 500 company, and was a part of a RIF, a reduction in force, where there's a massive layoff. And he just could not find another job. And it was no reflection on his experience or his job performance. He had stellar references. And it was just bad timing. And he could not get a job. And so he took a job at Home Depot, and because that was the job that was available. And it was a job that he could work in the evening so that during the day he could interview and be available for consulting gigs. And I just was so impressed with that, because it really took a lot of humility, I thought, for him to take a job that wasn't, working at Home Depot. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, but it didn't have anything to do with his education or his skill set. But he was happy to take a job that was paying and proud of it, and it bridged the gap for him financially. And he asked me if he should mention that in his interviews, and I said, absolutely. I think that's such an admirable trait, and it doesn't really matter that you're not working a job right now that's in line with what your expertise is. What matters is that you're working. And I think that interviewers would be interested in hearing that. And he went through a few different interviews and ultimately got a position, and called me with his wife on speakerphone and thanked me for, helping him. And, we worked on some role playing, and because he had a job for so long, he was a terrible interviewer. And Rebecca and I say this all the time: if you're a really good interviewer, you might not be the best employee, because you shouldn't have a lot of practice with this.
Right.
You want to be a professional interviewer.
Yeah,
Right.
I took a special interest in him and spent a lot of time with him, coaching him on his interviewing skills and helping him craft his resume and encouraging him to incorporate what he was doing right now that he was actively working. He got references from his superiors at Home Depot, and it worked out. And he ultimately ended up getting a job, and still worked at Home Depot on Saturdays because he liked it so much. And it's an amazing.
I love that story.
Yeah, it was really that call from him and his wife. Just I carried that with me for so long, because it was just the best feeling.
So I think I know why people would hesitate to put that on, to speak about it in an interview. Oh, and by the way, I'm working at Home Depot in the evenings and loving it. But I know you and Rebecca, in your experience, would have more specifics about why you would hesitate to do that, and then reasons that you should do it.
Yeah, I think people are concerned about maybe devaluing their skill set or their experience by saying that they took a position in another industry. That it might be somehow a strike against them instead of for them. And
particularly retail.
Sure. And I would always say that it's a positive, and that it's something that you should share and incorporate into your story.
It shows resilience and perseverance, that you're not necessarily just sitting unemployed waiting for your next job. Not that that's what anyone is doing, but it takes a certain amount of motivation to propel yourself forward into the unknown, into a different industry, and make ends meet until you get the next job within your industry.
Well, and as Gail said, that reality of humility, I think that speaks volumes.
Says a lot about your character.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It does. And the people that would dismiss you because of that aren't the people you want to work with.
Maybe not.
Okay, Rebecca, what about you? What is your pivotal moment when you realized that you were on the right track finally, after being a career gypsy for so many years?
I actually, and Gail will remember this, we were working together. I had made a placement, or I was working with one of the largest hedge funds in the world. And they have a very lengthy interview process, and they really hire the best of the best. And it's tough to get a job there. And I emailed back and forth with a woman who we wanted to interview. I wanted to interview her to send her on to the company for a position, and we couldn't do a phone interview because she was legally deaf. So she came in to do an interview, and the sweetest woman. I wanted to do anything I could to help her. She, by the way, was so overqualified for this position. It was for some type of administrative role. And she had certifications from all the Microsoft Office suite programs. She was ready to go. But she was very forthcoming in the sense that she could not speak on the phone. She could speak with you in person, but because she was legally deaf, she could not have a phone call. because she wouldn't be able to hear it. So there would have to be other means of communication. So I worked with my counterparts at this hedge fund, and they loved her, and they ended up hiring her and making it work. And she was obviously very grateful, but it was she would tell me that I was a motivation or whatever it was, and thank you. But I have to tell you, she motivated me so much. And the words that she gave me, I still hold with me dearly, as inspiration, as I speak to other people, that, we as recruiters, as sometimes the middleman, the hiring managers, between these companies and the candidates looking for a job, we can help tell stories in a way that you can't otherwise. And just that influence was really, it clicked for me. And I knew that this was the right path.
Because you could advocate for somebody in a different way than you could if you were on one side or the other.
It was harder for her to just submit her resume and get an interview. It's hard for anyone to submit your resume. That's the biggest hurdle, to get from the resume to the interview stage. Mm-hmm. And if you have someone on your team who can help tell your story, it can really help your chances. And that situation made that very clear for me.
Oh, especially with that, with being deaf, has to have played a role in her frustration and not being able to get an interview, especially if they were expecting to do a phone interview, which I've done a handful of times. And
yeah, she couldn't do those. And that was the first step of it. So we had to work in order to create a new process for her.
That's terrific. I love that. Well, it sounds a lot like your story too, Gail, in that you could advocate for somebody and really feel like you were contributing to the value, not only of the employer, but for that employee.
Yeah, Rebecca and I definitely both feel that responsibility of being advocates for our candidates. And it's work that we're passionate about, and is so rewarding. We share these stories with each other all the time because we're both uplifted by them, even if it's not happening to us directly.
And we carry that with us through the Hire One, Help One program, because now we're advocates for those women as well. And, it means a lot to us.
This has been so great. I'm hesitant to wrap it up, but I know that there's a time limit that people will listen to a podcast, but we could probably do another one in the future and talk about something completely different and still spend an hour together visiting. Yeah. But let's wrap it up with one more story. Something, again, one of those pivot points that maybe was an obstacle that you turned around, particularly in the Hire One, Help One situation. Was there something that was kind of a struggle for each of you that you had to kind of work through to, something specific that you had a hard time with, like seeing somebody in a bad position? Or, because that's always hard for me when I see somebody that is obviously in pain that I don't feel like I can help.
I think part of what we do is not pretty. We hear a lot of stories working with these women that are sometimes hard to comprehend, I think, for anyone. That's definitely, I have to say, that's been a challenge for me, is to connect with them and really hear the person and what they've gone through, and help them then build a better future, hopefully. I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but that's been with building this program. I mean, to be just very vulnerable, to meet people who are very vulnerable. But I really enjoyed that aspect of it, I think, too. It makes it very rewarding to have that connection.
That's definitely part of it. I'm sure there is an individual that you're visualizing in your head right now. And I ask that because I had a tough conversation with a friend of mine who his son died in a car accident. Yeah. And the difficulty for me was not holding on to his grief, because most people, when they have a friend who goes through that, they disappear because they don't want to see that grief and think, oh my gosh, that could be me. It could be my kid.
Yeah.
And so they disappear. They don't show up for people who are grieving. The people that you think that you think are close friends, those are the ones that don't show up because they can't face that grief themselves. And so for me, that is something that is really difficult. And going to this man's home and hugging him and trying to allow him to grieve without me grieving with him. Because it would have, it's so tempting to just burst into tears with him and say, could be my kid. But that's not where they are at that point. You're there for them. It's not about your grief. So I can imagine that you've had experiences with certain women that you have to be able to separate yourself enough to provide that, what they need from you.
Yeah. That's one of the things that working with the Domestic Violence Crisis Center is so important for us.
We learn so much from them.
We learn, and every day we learn more. One of the things that resonated with me when we started working with them is our contact there said, you have to remember that it takes 7 times, on average, 7 times for a victim to actually leave forever that situation. They go back on average 7 times. So be prepared for that, and don't be discouraged
or judgmental.
Absolutely. And so I think that's difficult, because you're pulling for these people, and you just see the potential, and they're so close, and then if they go back, it's just a heartbreak.
Part of the process.
It's part of the process. And so acclimating ourselves to that, and
the ups and downs,
knowing that that's the process, and going with it, and continuing to be available and a resource as many times as they need to come back is just part of this. And so that's something we learned from our counterparts at Domestic Violence Crisis Center, and has been invaluable.
Wow. Yeah, I can imagine that would be really hard to watch.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, ladies, for joining me on the podcast today. I'm so grateful for the time that you took to visit with me.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been my pleasure. I will write up a blog post associated with this podcast, and I will post it on my website, elkinsconsulting.com. And I will have links to your 2 businesses, the for-profit and your not-for-profit.
It's just one business.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
great.
so we have a company with a double bottom line. So they're intertwined, they sustain each other. So Next Stop Search has the Hire One, Help One program.
And it's a 1-for-1 model. So for every person we place, we donate career coaching and employment assistance to a victim of domestic violence.
Wow. That's awesome. Thank you so much. And not just thank you for being on the podcast, but thank you for doing what you're doing, because it's not only contributing to our global community in a way that nothing else really can, but it's inspiring to others to know that there are people out there that are doing it, and maybe more people will reach out, recognize the issues, and address them in whatever way they can. So thank you for doing what you do.
Oh, that means a lot.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell